Bonjour, everyone. Delighted to have you with us here today for this G7 Pensions Dialogue held on the sidelines of the inaugural, French title, the inaugural European Indo-Pacific Summit in Paris today. And without further ado, I'm gonna welcome our panelists today. Moving south, I guess geographically and Zoom-wise, we have the Honorable Nick Cherry in Melbourne. Bonjour or bonsoir, Nick.
Bonjour.
Moving a little bit further northwest, I guess, because he's originally from Liverpool, we have with us the great Jeffrey Houston of the London government pension scheme and LGPS, and a little further east, because I guess Holland and Italy are a few miles east of London, we have the great Dr. Zammit-Lucia, who just published at Bloomsbury's 2 weeks ago in London, his latest opus, to use a Roman word, the title of which is The New Political Capitalism. And we thought that that title fits very nicely with the topic of our discussions today, because we're going to discuss, the bloody crossroads, to use a Trotskyite metaphor, or the intersection where finance, the economy, and political science intersect, and how that intersection is having an increasing impact on the way financial markets, be they listed, the stock market, or non-listed, private equity and infrastructure, operate. I'm going to ask the Honorable Nick Cherry to look straight into the camera, as opposed to giving us his beautiful Greek profile. But without further ado, as an entrée into today's discussion, I think, we all know each other. So I think there's no need for further flowery intros. Let's jump right into the plat du jour. And let's start with the new Political Capitalism, which is, being published not only when we're witnessing what Nick Cherry and I have called the emergence of pensions superpowers. So the fact that there are 5 or 6 countries, including Britain and Australia, of course, whose combined pension assets now are by several multiples bigger than the GDPs of most nations, most industrialized nations, for the first time in history. So really, that emergence of pension superpowers is having a big effect on financial markets and on policy thinking and policy making the world over, not only in Australia, Canada, America, Holland, and Britain. And also, we are hearing that the interaction between America and China and Russia is becoming more tense. Some people are speaking of a new Cold War. As we speak today, 22nd to 2022, an ominous date. As we speak today, there are signs, not only in the Straits of Taiwan, but along the river Dnipro in Eastern Europe, that the Cold War may become hot. So all this is happening precisely at the same time. Some may say coincidentally, but maybe it's not a coincidence. And so I will turn now to Joe and tell us, when you started thinking about writing that book 2, 3, 4 years ago, when the idea started maturing, as it were, in your head, what gave you that hunch? What gave you the intuition that today all these things, geopolitics, geoeconomics, policy, and finance would collide and merge, as it were?
Yes. So the kind of proximate trigger for starting on the book was a conversation I was having with the chairman of a big multinational company. And he said to me, we were having a coffee, and he said, I've just come from breakfast with a bunch of other chairs. And we were talking about politics. And we realized that politics and business operate to fundamentally different logics. And quite frankly, we just don't understand political logic. So I thought, well, that's kind of strange. But then I recall my own career in multinational business. And the narrative used to be, if only politics would keep out of our way, then we can get on with the business of business. And we have lived through a period in our lifetimes of people our sort of age. You're younger, Nick, but people our sort of age. We've lived through a kind of golden period. We've lived through a period of very little conflict, of the idea that the political framework of Western liberal social democracy had won the battle of ideas, and that therefore we didn't need to worry about politics very much, and we could focus on commerce and economics and focus on making money. And those of us and business leaders who were brought up in the 80s and 90s were brought up in that mentality, that commercial and economic priorities would drive almost everything. And, you know, capitalism has been a very resilient system. And the reason it's been resilient is because it's been adaptive. So, you know, we've had feudal capitalism, we've had mercantilist capitalism, we've had industrial capitalism, we've had consumer capitalism. And throughout the late 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, we found ourselves in a system of financialized capitalism, where the only thing that mattered in the world was something that could have a dollar sign put on it. And where the whole purpose of business was to funnel money to shareholders. And I say funnel money to shareholders instead of the usual words, which are to create shareholder value. Because much of the value, much of the money that is funneled to shareholders is not actually value created. It is value stolen from environmental damage, from social cohesion, from institutional capital, from political capital. It is value that is taken from those other forms of capital and converted to money that is then funneled to shareholders. So the idea of creating shareholder value is false. And the idea that the role of business in society is solely the maximization of shareholder value as measured by money, and only as measured by money, is also false. So I thought, okay, having had this conversation and looking at the world around us, I thought maybe it is time that we started looking at the world in a different way, that we had some way of trying to get business people to understand and appreciate why and how political logic is different from business logic. And we're now have entered for a bit of time, the era where the battle for political ideas is back. It's no longer, Western social liberal democracy has won and let's just move on with the business of making money. The battle of political ideas is back. We have China with its authoritarian regime and the merging of business and politics into one. And we can observe the power of being able to mobilize your commercial, the whole business community for national interest, done in a way that can't be done in the West, but we have to find a different way of doing that. And so we've got we've entered a different world, basically. And that was the stimulus for writing the book.
Fascinating, fascinating. Before we move first to, I was going to say Tasmania, but it's today he's in Melbourne. So before we move first to Melbourne, to Nick, and then to London, to Jeffrey, who have more questions for you, I just had a small question / remark for you, which is the following, which is, I agree fully with everything you said, of course, and it's music to my ears. Just have one more caveat or remark, which may be interesting for the future, because of course, you're saying the new political capitalism, and I think you have partly in mind China and Russia, and I think we'll come back later to the fact that one of the reasons why now in the West, democratic liberal governments have suddenly realized that it's important to invest in airports, highways, and high-speed rail is precisely because of what the Chinese government did in the recent past, because until recently, in many so-called, industrialized Northern Hemisphere countries, it didn't matter to have decrepit, decaying airports or very slow trains. And it's only because, mostly, I would argue, because of, the fear of being left behind by China that, policymakers in Washington, D.C. and London say, oh my God, we need to invest more in infrastructure. And look at Africa and Asia and Latin America. There are thousands of Chinese civil engineers building bridges, physically and metaphorically, in Brazil, Mexico, and Malaysia. Maybe we should be less stingy, and maybe we should help, pension funds from the Northern Hemisphere and Australia go to emerging markets and invest in infrastructure. So clearly there's that Chinese dynamic, but I would argue it may not be that new, because if you look at the Belle Epoque, or as our British cousins say, if you look at the Edwardian era, that thinking was already there. And, Theodore Roosevelt, for example, was very much into that line of thought. And he was a Francophone and Francophile American thinker and policymaker. And Theodore Roosevelt, when he came up, with the plank of his, not Lib Dem, but his like centrist American party back in the Edwardian era, he said that he was shocked coming back from Berlin to see that German big business and German big government were working hand in hand, and that German worker had better pensions, blah, blah, blah. And Theodore Roosevelt argued that if we in America keep on doing a pure laissez-faire, we will be left behind, because that combination or alliance between big industry, big finance, and big government was something that could, put financial markets and the economy on its head and leave the Anglo-Saxons behind. So, but Theodore Roosevelt brand of, centrist republicanism did not, at the time, apart from one mandate, but did not, succeed. And now we're back in the year 2022, and more Western policymakers, right, maybe tempted to fight, quote unquote, Beijing, to have what you call a capitalist, whatever, a new capitalist, sort of semi-statist model of their own, right?
If I can react to that, you're right that this is not new, but we had forgotten it for a period. But you put it in the context of geopolitics, which is one political context that is driving this. But it's not the only political context, because even within national politics, the system isn't working. We have rising inequality. We have lots of regions, people, areas left behind while others are coining it. We have, a system that is driving fundamental environmental damage. So it's not just a geopolitical issue, it is also a national political issue. There is also another additional issue, which is the rise of the multinational company. Which is the rise of the multinational company and the multinational business model, which has fractured the concept of a political economy. We have politics that still has political legitimacy only at the national or subnational level. And yet we have commerce that doesn't care about national boundaries. So we have this fracture of the political economy, and this is unsustainable. And that thought is also not new, because de Gaulle worried about that during his time. And he saw it coming, but he could not prevent it.
Yes.
So there are a number of political issues at geopolitical level, at local level, and this fracture, this loss of political legitimacy of commercial enterprise by playing one country off against the other.
Yes, I think it's fascinating. I agree with you. And we're just moving now to Melbourne. I'm going to ask my colleague Olivier to switch to Melbourne. But you're absolutely right about de Gaulle and about, an Englishman or an Anglo-Scottish American intellectual turned politician named Harold Macmillan. And, young Macmillan, long before he became prime minister, in the 1930s, wrote many books along that same sort of, nonconformist line. But, Macmillan, just like Theodore Roosevelt and de Gaulle, were kind of lonely voices. But, today, I agree with you, today it may become more mainstream. And to discuss that further, we're moving now to another centrist progressive thinker in Melbourne, the Honorable Nick Cherry, who wanted to ask you some questions. Nick, the floor is yours.
Joe, just referring to that last point you made about the challenge of globalization, the growth of multinationals who have little or minimal regard for regulatory environments within a country. They can often ignore country regulation, and the failure, I think it's largely a failure of countries, and an understandable failure, to be willing to give up sovereignty in order to oversight and regulate effectively at a global level those large multinational businesses as the world economy has been ever increasingly and accelerating pace globalizing. But so I'd be interested in, we've made tentative steps with a number of organisations. We have some international regulatory economic institutions, but their effective power, given what's happened in the global economy, is very small. And I confess a dilemma about how you do effectively at a global level have some level of effective regulation over global multinationals in terms of behaviour, in some cases exploiting consumers, misusing data, misusing their economic power, and behaviours of that sort. And I don't see an easy solution to that because of the reluctance of countries to agree on a global framework to effectively regulate. So I'd be interested in your perspective on that challenge. And then quickly, you had your conversation with the chair of a large business. And I mean, I must say, I've been in politics directly for over 22 years. I'm not sure it was that black and white. I've dealt with a lot of businesses in my time in politics in the 80s and 90s who were pretty switched on when it came to the political game. So I'm not sure it's actually been that black and white and that recent a discovery that business did not get or understand politics. And the third point I'd be interested, you refer to the new battle of ideas. The battle of ideas is back. I do take, again, I don't think it's that black and white. I believe there's always been a battle of ideas particularly in a country, in a democracy, and probably not as public in countries that are not democratic. There's always been a battle of ideas. It's just that the ideas we're debating are quite different. ESG, pollution, environment, global warming, inequity within income distribution, which is inequity has been growing in many countries. So again, I'm not my critique would be we've always had the battle of ideas. It's just the battlefield, if you like, has changed that we're fighting over.
Thank you. So let's start with the multinational question. De Gaulle and others warned that this would happen and that it would be problematic, but we're unable to prevent it. So it's happened, and now we're seeing the consequence of it. So how to regulate? I think there's another thing that has changed, which is that the solution, if I can call it a solution, or the pressure to change is now not only coming from governments through regulation. Corporations are now under influence and under pressure from a lot more groups and directions that have influence. There are activist groups out there. Customers themselves will make purchasing decisions based on different criteria. The investment community is changing its views and in terms of what they want to fund and what they don't want to fund. So I think that it's no longer, thankfully, I think, that we have to find a single regulatory bullet because such a bullet doesn't exist. And with the world as it is moving, the likelihood of getting global agreement on anything is very difficult and almost non-existent. But I think a complex system and a complex ecosystem has developed where lots more people have a voice. Social media, with all its problems, has given more people a voice. I think customers are behaving more like citizens than like consumers, slowly, but not everybody. So I think there are now multiple, if you like, regulatory, let's call it that, multiple regulatory pressures that are impinging on how companies do business. So I think that helps. On the government regulatory side, I think that also there is a change to an understanding that regulation is not just about stopping people doing bad things, but regulation has a broader social role, which is to shape markets and to shape, if you like, the rules of the game and shape, therefore, how people behave within them. So I think there are a lot of different pressures, all pushing in the same direction. Will the multinational model disappear? No. Will they all start paying their taxes? No. Will they all, stop using slave labor? No. But the pressures are all in that direction. And, as with all cultural and political change, it's not a straight line from A to B. I see it more like a sailing boat in rough seas, where you tack backwards and forward depending on the prevailing political wind. Sometimes you go backwards. You don't really know the general direction, but you know the general direction, but not the destination. So we can't expect nice, linear, predictable progress, but I think everything is pushing in the same direction. The other question you asked is that the battle of ideas was always there, and you're quite right about that. The question I would raise at this point is the window of breadth of those political ideas. So a battle of political ideas is always there, but I think, at least my impression is that through after the late 70s, the 80s and 90s, that window was pretty narrow. I mean, I take the UK as an example, and it could be argued, and it is argued by many, is that Tony Blair's 10 years or 12 years or whatever they were essentially continuity Thatcher with a softer face. So, it wasn't a revolution. This third way idea was not a very, it was a belief in markets, a belief in neoliberal ideology, a belief in people standing for themselves, but with a little bit more state intervention, a little bit more, because it was a Labour government. But fundamentally, the breadth of political ideas was nothing like the beginning of the 20th century with the Bolshevik Revolution and, Marxism versus capitalism and whatever. The window narrowed very, very dramatically. Now I think the window is broadening again. We have a lot more, a lot more people arguing for national self-dependence, whereas in the 80s and 90s, the idea that globalization was, the only way forward, there is no alternative, was well accepted. So I think that we're starting to see, questions of identity have come to bear again on political ideas. Obviously, we have resurgent authoritarian regimes that had kind of disappeared from the global stage as any sort of major power, following the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, they were always there in some countries, in African countries and elsewhere, but they didn't impact the battle of political ideas and the consequences of that like China is doing. So I think the window of the battlefield, the breadth of the battlefield of political ideas is expanding relative to what it was towards the end of the 20th century. Of course, you always have a battle of political ideas, otherwise we have no politics. The other question you asked is that some businesses that you've dealt with understood the political game. And of course, that's right. And, a bunch of businesses, and depending what business you were in, you had to understand the political game. I mean, if you were in the oil business, then, they've always been strongly affected by geopolitics, and they've always been very skilled at that. But I don't know the extent to which that covered most businesses. I think many felt, politics is there, please keep out of my way and let me get on with doing business. And when I interact with the political system, it's for the purposes of lobbying for my narrow self-interest. That was basically the frame for a significant proportion of businesses. I think that has changed. I think now there is a broader, businesses are needing to learn a lot more how things that are being done for political reasons in the broadest sense. So if you define politics, it depends how you define politics. So I define politics very broadly. I define politics as the mechanism by which we make collective decisions. And business has, to a significant extent, felt that that wasn't part of its remit. Now I think there is more of a realization that business is a political institution, that it impacts the kind of society we live in. And therefore it is by definition a political institution and has to take its responsibilities for that. And I don't think that, business leaders brought up and getting to the top, getting towards the top in the 80s and 90s had to worry very much about that.
Right. Bonjour, Dr. Shpak. Do you have a question for Joe? If not, I will jump in myself with the next question, which is the size of pension assets. That's really a determining factor of today's era, because in previous periods of geo-economic emergence, like the Edwardian era or Wilhelmian Germany of the Kaiser era, the big business in question were the big steel industrialists and big bankers. And today there's something new, is that probably the biggest companies in the world are actually big banking conglomerates, and even more so big pension funds and sovereign funds. Now, can we call them business? It's a different issue, but at least when they act as investors, they are considered private investors, even though behind that, as Jeffrey well knows, there's a lot of public savings and a lot of civil servants, state employees savings and long-term national central bank reserves. Yet when they act buying shares or bonds, we treat public pension funds and sovereign funds as private actors. And to make a long story short, the size of their assets now in countries like Australia, Holland, Canada is 190, 200% of GDP, which is really unheard of in history. And in some countries, when they buy shares or when they sell shares, on certain days of the week, their actions represent 30, 40, 60% of the volumes on a particular day at the London Stock Exchange or the Paris Stock Exchange, etc. So the sheer size now is really huge. And I think that's something new, typical of the current age of geoeconomics, right? So I'll ask the question in succession, maybe to Joe, Jeffrey, and then Nick Cherry. So is it something typical or defining of our current, post-Brexit age of geoeconomics, in your opinion? First, Joe.
So you're right. There are these vast pools of money held in these institutions. And that gives these institutions power. It gives them social power. It gives them cultural power. And therefore, it makes them inherently political. Now, we've gone through a period where the accepted wisdom was that these institutions had only one role to play, which is to maximize their returns. Okay? I think that is changing. I think what is changing is to say, no, these institutions have a much more important role to play. And we need to find a way where our political objectives, our social objectives are shared with these institutions, and that we're all traveling in the same direction. And the idea that, make the maximum of your returns and we don't care about anything else, I think those days are starting to end. Now, how we get this alignment and this cooperation in practice is something that we're still starting to work out. Nobody has the answer. But at the geopolitical level, I think there's another thing that we should bear in mind, which is that commerce became the locus of conflict. Nick, you like to quote Professor Luttwak, I have a quote from him in my book, which says, "The admixture of the logic of conflict with the methods of commerce," or as Clausewitz would have put it, "the logic of war in the grammar of commerce." So, you know, at the geopolitical level, how these funds are used becomes a projection of geopolitical power, as we've seen with China and everywhere else. But in the West, we gave that idea up for decades. I think that idea is coming back. How we do it, we still have to work it out. You're muted, Nick.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you to
I presume you were passing over to me then, Nick.
I am. I'm going to ask you to come a little bit closer to the screen. Come a little bit closer to the screen. A little bit more, yeah, so we can see you better.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, that's better. That's better. And then Jeff, and then Nick.
Okay, thank you very much. Joe, I was fascinated by your book and lots of things that were in there. I just want to pick up on a number of them. First of all, on that journey that you talk about from denial to compliance to innovation and then to cooperation. And I think I agree with probably most people on this call. We've got past denial. We're probably in compliance, but we're struggling with the innovation bit. And I just would bring in there another concept that you bring in. You talk about political capitalism, and then you talk about politically controlled capitalism, you know, the Chinas and whatever. But presumably that as well is a long line, and you can be somewhere on those lines. And I'd be interested in your views on where you think government's role is in taking us from compliance into innovation. Is it just about creating a framework, or is it actually about intervening? So I see, for example, the Levelling Up white paper that was brought out in the UK is an example of where government is trying to push financial institutions like pension funds in a particular way to address something that it's identified, that people were failed by globalism, and therefore certain areas need to be brought up. So is it a case of governments just creating a framework for things like pension funds to go from compliance into innovation, or do they have a role to actually push them in some way from compliance into innovation, which can be about direction, but it can also be about breaking down barriers? And then secondly and quickly, your point about not trying to monetize social capital or natural capital. Now, in some ways, absolutely yes. But in a world where we are so used to concepts like fiduciary duty, if we can't find a way to measure, monetize, and put a measure of value on social capital and natural capital, how can we convince our trustees that they are complying with their fiduciary duty of turning the contributions, the financial capital given to them by their members, into something that is valuable at the end of the day? Is it okay for the pensioner potentially to get less money, but a better world?
Okay, so difficult questions. So in terms of how to create this cooperative atmosphere, this excuse me a minute, this everybody pulling in the same direction, we still have to learn how to do that. I mean, the Chinese model is not going to work in the West, I hope. And governments of different colors will take different approaches. What I'd like to see is the abandonment of this false dichotomy that we've created, that it's either a laissez-faire neoliberal framework where, you know, we just let the market, we just let private enterprise rip and do what they want, and, you know, by magic the world will be a better place, or this kind of oppressive statism, where the only way to do anything is to have government do it. And those are the only two ideas that have been around for a while. And we still need to develop, the idea of how do we encourage, how do we shape markets? How do we provide stick and carrot to marshal all our resources, or as many of our resources as we can, in the same direction? We don't know how to do it because we haven't done it, but we have to learn how to do it. And it needs the mindset, both of government and of the private sector, that this is a good thing to do.
Right.
And we're not quite there yet. I mean, one of the disappointments for me, and there were many good things, but one of the disappointments of the Levelling Up white paper is that it didn't mobilize behind it the private sector. The levelling up cannot happen in the UK without the private sector. It is simply impossible. Okay?
Yeah. Good point. We're moving now to Melbourne, and before that, I'll make a transition. Before moving to Melbourne, is that I think that sadly, the Level Up white paper, which was published precisely, I think, 19 days ago in Westminster, sadly was put together a bit hurriedly because of Boris Johnson's personal circumstances. So I think he wanted to relaunch his government, and he put together these forward-looking policy themes. Also because he was afraid of losing popular support in the formerly Labour-leaning northern seats of England. So I think this is how it was put together hurriedly. But I think policymakers tend to consider that public pension funds are, quote unquote, private sector actors. So already there is that in that first iteration of the Level Up white paper. And I think if you listen to Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson, they claim that they want to involve the private sector because they want to leverage the government's balance sheet, and they look at the place where there is money, and there is money right at local and government and state pension fund level, and they say, oh, let's leverage that, and let's release the pent-up investment potential that these billionaires have into infrastructure and private equity, and we'll wave the magic Australian-Canadian wand, and everything will be great. But is it true? And I'm asking that rhetorically, and I'm turning, of course, to the Honorable Nick Cherry, who's one of the fathers of the Australian pension miracle. Is it true? Is it that easy to wave the magic Australian model, Nick?
Absolutely not. I mean, it's despite the similarities between Australia and the UK, and we were colonies of the UK, we're very different economic, social, political environment. But before I come to levelling up, I absolutely agree with Joe. It's a work in progress. It really is a work in progress. And I look back at, and it's further advanced in some countries than others for different reasons, their economic, pension structure, role of government, etc. But if I look back 40 or 50 years ago, what were the dominant financial institutions in Western economies? And they were banks and they were insurance companies and maybe smaller mutuals, credit unions, building societies. Pension funds, by and large, 40, 50 years ago, did not get a mention. They weren't in the scene. There are some countries, and I stress it's some countries, where their level of pension assets at arm's length from government, however that's structured, at arm's length from government, and the Dutch, the UK, Canada, US, and Australia, of course, with its system. And what is fascinating is I think those pension funds and pension fund systems have been more adaptable and more responsive to changing community attitudes through recognition of a fiduciary duty. Yes, it's about rational investment and maximising return, but because you are representing members and providing for their pension savings, you also need to consider their views, and their views have evolved in areas like ESG. And I do get a bit concerned. There's a lot of focus on the environment, and that's rightly so, but there's also social and governance. And there's numerous examples, obviously, in Australia and elsewhere of environmental issues and pressures, but governance. I mean, one of the most successful aspects of pension fund activity in Australia has actually been on governance, executive pay, board pay, those sorts of issues. So pension funds are reflecting the change in attitudes in society of their members. That's in some countries. I mean, some countries still have very significant government pay-as-you-go systems. And I'm glad you mentioned, Nick, we've also got sovereign wealth funds. And I think sovereign wealth funds, not exclusively, but if you look at non-democratic countries, particularly the oil, gas countries that are not democracies, they use their sovereign wealth funds very proactively. I'm not sure particularly focused on ESG, but they certainly use them proactively and not necessarily the most efficient in terms of capital. So that they would be my. And what's interesting is that you've got the Vanguards and the BlackRocks. It's not just your traditional arm's length pension fund. You've got big movement now from big global fund managers. Sure, they manage some of the assets of pension funds, but they also manage lots of other financial savings. And I think that's a really interesting shift. And then, of course, I think they're pretty much following, but they are following the traditional financial institutions such as the banks.
Can I stop you here? I'll stop you here. So you mentioned sovereign wealth funds and very big, huge American asset management companies. I'll stop you there, and we'll move on that issue later. But I am aware of the fact that Jeff needs to jump onto a train, so we'll move back to London now for one last question to Jeff before we let him go. So to use an Anglo-Norman medieval metaphor, you guys at the cash-rich state and local public pension schemes, you must feel flattered by what the Prime Minister says, but at the same time, you must feel like a big fat pheasant when you have like a lion, looking at you with amorous eyes. And I think that could be the issue you're facing in the coming quarters, how to please the lion without being devoured by him. So how can you guys, trustees, board members, collaborate, cooperate, take advantage of that new will from the government without being devoured by the government?
You're muted, Jeff.
Do that properly. There are a couple of things there. Thanks, Nick. I think, first of all, it's about a discussion with governments about what they can do about the barriers to our investment. It's not a question of we've got a lot of trustees who don't want to do this kind of stuff. Doing things like UK impact investment is what they want to do. It's about the barriers that are currently between them and being able to do that. Barriers like scale, for example. Lots of the opportunities that I see, fantastic opportunities in social housing, on renewable energy, are tiny. They're absolutely tiny, and therefore it's very difficult for large pension funds to be able to invest in them because we just don't have the resource to do the due diligence, due diligence on the hundreds and thousands of opportunities that there are out there at that scale. So how do we deal with that scale? I think that's a big barrier for us. And then in terms of, how do we avoid getting devoured? It goes back to what I've just said. These are not things that pension funds in the UK don't want to do. Absolutely. When we were encouraged to go more into infrastructure, we went into infrastructure. So infrastructure investment went up significantly over a period of time. And then we were told, actually, you're investing in infrastructure in the wrong place. You need to be invested in UK rather than abroad.
Yeah.
So this is about encouraging people to do what they want to do anyway, to enable them to do what they want to do anyway. And to a certain extent, the last thing the government should be doing is telling them to do it, because you then get the opposite reaction.
Yes.
I mean, as Nick Sherry will know, as soon as central government says to local government, you must do this, they'll find a reason not to do it.
Yeah. Can I react to a previous question from Jeff about fiduciary duty that you mentioned? I would have two responses to that. One is that the legal framework of what constitutes fiduciary duty is changeable. So
yes.
It doesn't have to be what it is today. So that can be done at the stroke of a pen, assuming one can get past the political quicksand. The second thing is, we accept as a normal part of your investments that returns vary depending on the age that you're in. So, you might have been making 10, 15, 20% returns at some point, and that was considered good. Today, you might be making, I don't know how much, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, whatever the number is. And you accept that because the world has changed. So, in a world of what I call this political capitalism, we don't know what appropriate returns for this new age are going to be. But, whatever they are, they're appropriate. You're not giving up your fiduciary duty because the world has changed.
Just a quick comment on the levelling up and Jeff's observations. I did think it was a little unfair. I mean, I read the paper that it was the local government scheme that got fingered. If you're expecting your pension fund system to invest to a greater extent and level up in outside London in whatever shape or form, that it needs to be a lot more than the local government scheme in the UK. Secondly, Jeff's quite right. I mean, there are the UK system their funds are quite small and they're relatively inexperienced in investing in infrastructure. Whereas the Australian, Canadian, Dutch, etc., have had a lot of experience, and investing in infrastructure is very, very complex. It's not a diversified equity play, very simple, low cost. It takes a lot of time, research and effort. The return is there, by and large, in a diversified infrastructure portfolio. And I think the third issue is you've got to have opportunities to invest in. So what are the infrastructure investments that are on the table in the UK outside London? What are they that the pension funds are going to invest in? Frankly, I'm not optimistic. I read the white paper and I respect and understand the political direction and the necessity. However, I do think, the stated date, I think, is 2030. It's only 8 years away. I don't see the sort of transformation that the government would hope being accomplished by 2030 for a whole lot of reasons that I just won't go into. So I do think, one of the learnings from Australia and Canada and the US and the Dutch is they've had a long experience, and they've got large systems, but they've also got some very, very large pension funds. And that's not the nature and structure of the UK market. So they'd be my sort of concerns and caveats about levelling up. And quickly, Joe's comment, you don't necessarily need the change in the law to get pension fund managers and trustees to change their approach. I mean, the irony of Australia is certainly our current Conservative government is very strongly opposed to changing the law to increase the focus on ESG, but it's happened anyway because the financial institutions and particularly trustees have the capacity and legal fiat to move and make judgments independently from government. I think that's one of the great ironies of Australia, where ESG issues are fought very, very fiercely for all the reasons. And I think it's one of the great ironies of the US too. Yeah. I mean, you had Donald Trump vehemently, doing everything he could to discourage a focus on ESG and global warming. But the pension funds were doing the opposite.
Yeah. Great. I'll stop you there, Nick, because you're making a great transition right now, unwittingly perhaps. Stay close to the camera. I think you need to come a bit closer to the camera, Nick. Yeah, perfect. Because Janice Turner just joined us in the nick of time, and Jeff Houston needs to jump on a train. Merci, Jeff. It was great to have you with us today. And we're pleased to welcome Janice Turner, who just joined us literally 5 seconds ago, and it makes a nice transition to what the Honorable Nick Cherry was saying, because effectively, the trustees have a role to play. And I think, the board members, and I think it's one of the reasons why Trump wasn't able to stop, the advance of SDG and ESG dynamics is precisely even in conservative, even in Republican-leaning right-wing states, quote unquote, like Alaska or Texas or Ohio, Republican-leaning center-right board members wanted their pensions to move the ESG way. So I think that's something that Trump and his advisors probably miscalculated when they tried to stop, the ESG dynamics, going through the heart of American public pension funds, even in Republican-leaning states like Alaska, Missouri, and Carolina. Janice just joined us, and I think the position of your screen was better 2 minutes ago, Janice. Don't move. Now it's perfect. Okay, do not move. It's perfect. So I think Nick Cherry made that beautiful transition about, sometimes policymakers, conservative or arch conservative policymakers wanting to stop that, rise of ESG, renewable energy, social and human rights put at the heart of the investment process itself, no longer a peripheral issue, but really, in the old days, you had a little ESG overlay. And so you could put 1 or 2% of your overall portfolio into ESG or impact funds and called it an overlay. Now, for many pension investors and sovereign funds and insurance companies, it's really moving center stage across all asset classes. So you in the UK with the AMNT, you've been at the forefront of that really movement. And I think Iuliia wanted to ask you a question in that regard. Iuliia, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks, Nick. Janice, great to see you. I think one of the first questions I was very keen to hear is from you is on the pioneering red lines approach to ESG investing. If you could share more about that, speak about the success of the program with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And also thank you, Nicolas, for inviting me to come along today. So the reason for the red line voting initiative to be developed by the AMNT was that we recognized, and this is going back to 2012, we recognized that shareholders that asset owners that actually wanted to play a real part in the stewardship of our assets had we had quite a major shock actually in 2012, because if you remember, there was the shareholder spring, where a lot of investors were trying to vote against excessive pay deals at company AGMs. And a lot of pension schemes wanted to get involved in that. And so they contacted their fund managers and said, we want our votes to be voted that way as well. And the fund managers said, well, you can't. And we said, why not? And they said, it's because you invest in pooled funds. And because you're in pooled funds, you've got no say over it, and, go away. And we just thought that's outrageous, because, nearly half the assets under management in the UK stock market is in pooled funds of one kind or another. And so what they were saying is that all of those pooled funds that are in equities, the asset owners have got no say over it. So we thought, well, that's just ridiculous. And so AMNT thought we needed to do something about that. And so what we felt we should do was we drew up actually the first publicly available, downloadable voting policy, which at the time was really new, because it went right across environment, social and governance issues. And we couldn't find any other at the time that did that was kind of freely available. So we developed that, and we did it over a couple of years in great consultation, not just with trustees, but also with analysts, fund managers, proxy voting companies, everybody. And we launched them in the end of 2015. And we then found that the fund managers wouldn't accept those either. And we were really astonished at that, because when we were talking to the fund managers, they'd actually said, well, one issue is that, we've got lots of clients. And so, it'd be very difficult for us to be taking all these different client policies. And so one point about the red lines is that they're made in a very easy to understand way. And, we felt that if a lot of trustees actually adopted them, then fund managers could actually vote en bloc on the red line basis. We also said that the red lines were a comply or explain. So basically, we weren't dictating to fund managers, you must vote against a company on this. We were actually saying that, they have to use their expertise and their knowledge and engage on these issues. And if they felt it was appropriate not to vote red line, then they can do so. They just have to explain to us why they did so. So we realized that we then therefore had to have a long campaign to persuade the fund management industry to adopt them. And so basically move forward several years. We now have the support of the government and the regulators in support of fund managers, actually having to acknowledge what their clients are saying. We've had one breakthrough, which was that AMX and DWS put together a fund which they launched about a year ago, where they were actually giving their clients a choice of voting policy. And one of them is the red lines. And the reason why we think this is important, and we do believe that we're on the way to having success with this, because of course BlackRock also made an announcement that they were going to allow a choice of voting policy to many of their clients as well. But the reason it's important is because the fund managers, no matter what they say about how progressive they are on various issues, it simply is not true for them, for the majority. AMNT has carried out surveys since about 2019, comparing our red line policies with those of a select number of fund managers, including some of the biggest. And for example, on climate change, we looked at 30 fund managers, and the result was that 40% of them, like 12 out of 30, didn't even disclose what their voting policy was on any ESG issue, or did not reference climate change in their voting policy at all, or reference climate change, but none of their references to AMNT's voting policies on climate met AMNT's voting policies on climate, and thus reasonable standards for taking action on climate change. So basically, an awful lot of fund managers may be saying that they're doing their best on climate change, but the evidence of their own policies does not back that up. And that is why we need to have a strong policy, and our fund managers should be accepting it.
But Janice, can I just ask the obvious question? Because that sort of approach in Australia, by and large, just is not acceptable, and it doesn't happen. Why don't the trustees change the fund manager? Say to them, look, this is what we want. If you don't deliver, we will move elsewhere.
if there were a lot of fund managers around that would accept it, that's fine. But if you have a wall of opposition by virtually all of the fund managers, it doesn't really give you very far to go. That's the issue.
I'm just a little surprised. It only takes one. When one moves and the wall of money moves, the wall comes down and the rest move as well.
I know. Well, I think
cartel,
this is
essentially.
there are various options. I mean, for example, pension schemes are now required to account for the stewardship of their assets, how it's been carried out by their fund managers, and we know that there's quite a few pension schemes that attempted to do that properly last year by writing to their fund managers and saying, you know, our policy on ethnicity on boards is as follows. What have you done about it? Or going further, the Parker Review, which obviously set targets for British companies to say that they should have at least one ethnic minority person on their board by 2021. They published an update last year that said that 16 FTSE 100 companies still hadn't got any ethnic minorities on their boards and 3 didn't report. So some of us analysed how their fund managers had voted at the AGMs of those companies, and it was clear that it just isn't an issue for so many fund managers, you know. And so basically, if, you know, that's a major issue. But when you write to fund managers and say and go to that detail, the fund managers are not interested in engaging with you. One major fund manager actually said to a client, you don't invest in our pool funds directly, you invest via our insurance company, and therefore we have no obligation to even account to you on stewardship because you're not a direct client of ours, which is absolutely shocking.
It's shocking, and ironically, I think in Europe and Britain, you have that sort of oligopolistic, entrenched situation, and ironically, we Brits and Europeans have that cliched image of America being very, you know, laissez-faire, neoliberal, ultra-capitalist. But ironically, on Wall Street, some of the CEOs of these very large asset management companies are actually ahead or more progressive than many of their European or British peers, which is counterintuitive. And, you know, a beautiful example is Larry Fink. If you read his letter, his annual letter published 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago in New York, it's quite impressive because he's taking a very, very forward-looking, progressivist almost stance on voting and governance, which is really ahead, I must say, you know, being European, but ahead of what many Europeans do or think. So, you know, ironically, salvation could come from Wall Street, not because they are inherently progressive, but they know that long-term, it's in their own best interest, right?
Yeah. But I think it's a bit like trying to turn around an ocean-going liner. And there have been ingrained practices, I think, in the financial services industry going back.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, absolutely, Janice. Look, I think one of the contrasts between Australia and the UK is our system is now so big and our pension funds are so big because of mergers. Literally, the fund managers go to the funds begging the funds and asking them what the terms are to invest with that asset fund manager. And secondly, I don't want to overstate it, but a lot of the pension funds now have a substantial proportion of their own of the assets directly owned and managed, as distinct from contracting out to a fund manager. And I think that's been a function of the Australian system and the size and the scale, but it's certainly been significant in the last 10 years. I think we had a somewhat similar position to the UK, 20, 25 years ago.
But it's an astonishing situation that I consider it astounding that we've got an industry where the industry seems to be acting as if they're the client.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, normally, if you're the client and you're paying lots and lots and lots of money to a company that you've hired to do work for you, you don't expect to be treated that way. It's astonishing.
But Janice, I don't want to play the devil's advocate, but it's because, and I'm not criticizing you, on the contrary, because I think what you guys did in London was amazing. But for many years, I mean, for decades or centuries, some pension fund board members were sleeping at the wheel. So basically, some pension fund trustees, they had pent up potential power, but because trust law is by design quite vague, and trust law leaves you, the board member, such a big leeway that if it's an old boys, old Etonian school of nice, gentlemen who do things the old-fashioned way, of course, they will not rock the boat and they will not flex their fiduciary muscles. And so the balance of power will shift automatically to the asset management industry. And after 1 or 2 or 3 decades, the asset management industry will perhaps think that it's normal that these guys, their clients, aren't flexing their fiduciary muscles. Therefore, the situation or the balance of power is natural. And all of a sudden, you came like 9-10 years ago, with the red line voting in London, and there were similar endeavors in Australia, Canada, and Holland. And some of these people, in the investment banking and the asset management industry were almost shocked to see that the client or the customer had some tastes and demands of his own, which he wanted, answered, or questions that he wanted answers. So I think it's all part of a cultural, political sort of readjustment. I'm aware of time, and maybe we should wrap up this amazing, beautiful conversation, but we'll have another one next month. So let's make it a monthly sort of get together of thought leaders from Tasmania to Toronto and from La Valette to Valletta. But so speaking of La Valette and Valletta, so we shall give the concluding remarks to Dr. Joe Zammit-Lucia, because I think we've covered many facets that you mentioned or alluded to in the new Political Capitalism. So it's a great book. I don't know if Olivier can zoom in on my screen here somehow. Let's try this. No? Okay, so we'll put that later on the video page and on the article later on. But basically, the book came out 3 weeks ago in London at Bloomsbury. It is the new Political Capitalism: How Business and Societies Can Thrive in a World Deeply Politicized, by Joe Zammit-Lucia. And so basically, I'll give back the microphone to Joe in London for the concluding remarks, about what we've said today, which is basically trusteeship, governance, ESG, and that new capitalism that we're seeing emerging.
So I thank you very much, Nick, and I found this a fascinating conversation, and Janice, quite fascinating the hurdles that you've had to overcome as a supposed client. So it's very interesting. But I think, and the remarks that were made earlier about, Trump trying to put a damper on ESG issues and essentially not succeeding, which I think gets back to the conversation we had a little bit earlier, that the winds driving this change are not just coming from governments. They're coming from many, many directions, which is good because it makes these winds inescapable. If they only came from governments, which, as we know, is slow, and regulation always has loopholes, and there's always an industry trying to find ways around it, progress would be much slower and much less reliable. But I think these winds of change pushing broadly in the same direction are inescapable because they're coming at you from everywhere. Now, of course, as Janice mentioned, there will always be people and groups who don't want to change because life is comfortable as it is. I mean, why the hell do you want to change when you're coining it with the system that you have? So that kind of resistance is inevitable, but eventually it will break down. Over what period, in what way, we don't really know. But it will break down, and I'm very encouraged that so many things seem to be pushing broadly in the same direction.
Great, and I think we still have 3 or 4 minutes. So let's move back now to Melbourne and to the Honorable Nick Cherry to give us a meta conclusion, to use a Greek word. But basically, we're holding our talk today on the sidelines of the inaugural, we French like long titles. So it's on the sidelines of the inaugural European Indo-Pacific Summit held today in Paris. And it's not a coincidence because it coincides, of course, with the French presidency of the European Union, and it coincides with AUKUS in Canberra, Washington, and London, where we French were kicked out of that submarine. Our submarines were torpedoed, to use a double metaphor. But it's all happening. It's all happening at the same time, right, Nick? And so,
it is. Look. I think firstly, congratulations to Joe on his book. I haven't read, I think 280, I haven't read it all, but I've read quite a fair slab of it in the last couple of days. Congratulations. I think it's a great work with some really great observations. I don't agree with everything, but great observations and great solutions. Secondly, look, I have my concerns with some of the issues in and around ESG, but the winds of change are coming. And, government, I mean, it's ironic that in the UK, you've got a very proactive right of centre government on ESG, whereas in Australia, you've got the opposite. But the flow, it is still happening because of the shift in societal attitudes. And I think pension funds have, in many countries, as part of, and the rest of the financial system, to be fair, it's not just pension funds now. Those financial decision makers, institutions, are driving change because, interestingly, they're probably democratically concluding and probably, I'm sure, got a greater sense of what the community wants than some governments at certain points in time. So, and I won't go into AUKUS, Nick. It's but a traditional Australian, UK, US defensive deal, which allows us to buy nuclear submarines, and unfortunately, France wasn't going to sell us nuclear submarines. But I just think that's another example of an extraordinarily complex framework of military and economic connections that are very complex. AUKUS is not an economic deal. It has no economic consequences other than the balance of payments will shift from France to the US, assuming we buy the subs from the US or the UK.
But, regarding the term, the term Indo-Pacific itself, right? So until recently, everyone and their sister was saying Asia, or the Asia Pacific area, APAC, and all of a sudden, it started with military strategists and geopolitical thinkers in Washington, D.C., who started using the term Indo-Pacific, and now all of a sudden, CEOs and bankers in London and Paris and Brussels are using it. So don't you think there's a link between geopolitics and finance in that regard?
Absolutely. And I mean, India is a great power. It's a great world economic power. Unfortunately, some countries seem to have missed it. And so when we talk about APAC, I do think there is some opportunism in adding Indo to the descriptor. A lot of the attention rightly has been on China, but in that context, we shouldn't forget the countries of Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Vietnam. I mean, they're going to be the first world top 20 global economies in the next 10 to 15 years. So it's just an interesting example about how people, perhaps for political and military opportunistic reasons, want to add another economic power to the equation, which is India.
Yeah. So Nick, before we cut off, Nick Sherry. Just to let you know that my book is due to be launched in Australia this month.
Oh, great.
So I'm going to drop you an email about that, and let's see if we can have a chat about it.
Good. Excellent.
Okay, I think, go ahead. Yeah, I think Iuliia is putting back the cover of your book on screen. It's available on Amazon and in every reputable bookshop in England and Europe, and soon in Australia. It was a pleasure to have you with us today. It was a delight, of course, to hear it firsthand from Joe Zammit-Lucia. Today, I think we had two Lib Dems for the price of one, because we had Joe Zammit-Lucia and Janice Turner at the same time. But we are centrist, so we're centrist and agnostic, which I guess makes us inclined to hear the views of what Lib Dems think about the economy and society. It was a pleasure to have you both, Janice Turner and Joe Zammit-Lucia, and Dr. Iuliia Shpak in London today also. Last but not least, our chairman, the Honorable Nick Sherry, who as usual valiantly stayed awake until whatever, 10 p.m. or 11 p.m. Australian time with some good Australian coffee. It was a pleasure to have you. And I'm going to thank also Jeffrey Houston of LGPS, LGA, who had to leave us a little earlier. And as I said, let's try to make it a bi-monthly gathering of great minds around that Zoom format, and hope to see you as the world reopens and as the first flights between Australia, Singapore, and London and Paris are being reopened as we speak. I hope to see you guys in the flesh in the coming weeks. À bientôt. À bientôt.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.